The Journey Beneath the System by Swapnil Saurav.
8. Road to Freedom. Everyone, friends and enemies alike, seized all movement at once. Bhavan sprang back, falling on his bottom in front of the body. He could feel one of his hands had gotten wet while lifting himself. He slowly raised it in front of his face and stared in horror at his bloodied fingers. "Is he?" Feyyaz whispered. The men let go of Feyyaz, Charvi and Arav immediately. "Arav!" Charvi yelled, and she threw herself to the floor to aid her friend, who was slumped in pain and coughing badly. Arav made an effort to turn his head towards the businessman. From that angle, he could clearly see the cause of death, a broken metal pipe, probably from one of the building's water system, sticking out of the ground and straight into his neck. Bhavan began shaking like a leaf, only his hand at first, then it extended to his entire body. "Ah!" He screamed suddenly. It was like his scream shook everybody back into reality. Feyyaz turned towards the henchmen and took a defensive stance, knowing it was a matter of time for them to take action. But they didn't. Instead, they ran away in all directions, as if the lack of a superior took away all of their strength. Bhavan just kept screaming in the same place. "He's dead. I killed him." Bhavan seemed to be in the middle of a panic attack. Arav tried to reason with him. "It was an accident, Bhavan. You couldn't have known that he was going to fall like that," he said. He tried to get up, but the effort made him wince and lay down again. "Arav, don't move," Charvi cried out, holding him. Feyyaz turned towards Arav. "They beat you pretty badly," he said, observing his friend. Then he looked around. "Guys?" Feyyaz asked, drawing his friend's attention. I think we're free," he said. Charvi looked around as well. By now, there was no one else in the alley. "Free?" Bhavan asked, still distressed. "Well, the gangsters ran away. And the businessman is gone," Feyyaz explained. Rather than alleviate his anguish, the last sentence worsened Bhavan's mental state. The poor boy opened his eyes widely. "Gone? He's dead. I just killed a man," he wailed. "He deserved to die anyway," Arav stated. "Arav, that's horrible," Charvi exclaimed. "But true," Arav replied. They all stared at the gruesome scene for several seconds. The businessman didn't look intimidating anymore. His overwhelming aura had vanished along with his life, leaving only a medium-sized, slightly chubby man with expensive clothes. Feyyaz approached Bhavan carefully. "Bhavan." He placed a hand on Bhavan's shoulder, but Bhavan shook it off brusquely. "Bhavan, look at me," Feyyaz insisted. Bhavan unwillingly turned his head away from the body and stared at Feyyaz. Feyyaz knelt next to him, so their faces were at the same level. Then he spoke in a firm voice. "Hey, you're not a murderer. You're a good man. We all know you. You were just protecting us, and you did what you had to do. You didn't even know that thing was there. None of this was your fault," he said. Arav spoke to Charvi quietly. "I'll be fine. Go with him." Charvi nodded and went towards her other friends. "That's not true," Bhavan replied to Feyyaz. "All of this was my fault." As he said, "If it hadn't been for my stupid ingenuity, you wouldn't have." Charvi didn't let him continue. "We all made mistakes, Bhavan. All of us accepted that man's proposal, one way or another. We all fell into his trap. And yes, we know you're not perfect, but we love you the way you are. That's why we're best friends. Now please stop blaming yourself. It's no use anymore." Bhavan clearly didn't seem convinced, but at least they had managed to make him stop panicking. Either way, what Feyyaz had said was right. They were free from the businessmen. "So, what now?" he asked. At that moment, they realized the police sirens could already be heard on the nearby streets. "They are here," Arav said. Charvi, Fayaz and Bhavin were sitting at a table in an interrogation room, looking at one another nervously. A high-ranking officer opened the door and entered. "How's Arav?" Bhavin asked him. "Your friend has some ugly bruises, but nothing serious. He was examined, and the doctors say he doesn't have any broken bones, so he should be alright soon," he answered. They sighed in relief. However, the toughest part was about to begin. The policeman dropped a case file on the table. "Now, we were called because of the museum alarm going off, but what we found was a mess and the body of a man. Would you care to explain?" The room went completely silent. Fayyaz shakily raised his hand. "Sir, that man was the businessman," he said. "So, you knew who he was?" the officer said. "At first, we had no idea, but the reports have just confirmed his identity. My question is, what were you doing in an alley with one of the most wanted men in the state? And how did he end up dead?" Fayyaz gave a nervous look to Bhavin. It was an accident. That metal pipe was there, and he fell," he began. "Are you implying that he simply fell on it?" After receiving a heavy hit to the face, the officer questioned sternly. There was silence again. "I did it, sir," Bhavin said. "I knocked him down, and when he fell, I heard a horrible sound. And when I looked at him, he was—" "No," Fayyaz interrupted him. Bhavin lifted his palm as a silencing gesture. "It's okay, Fayyaz, please," he said solemnly and turned back towards the officer. "I was the one who got in trouble with the businessman, and he took my friends as hostages to force me to break into the museum for him, but it went wrong. I'll tell you everything I know. But my friends, they didn't do anything wrong, I swear. Please let them go." The officer stared at Bhavin, evaluating him. Then he looked at Charvi, who hadn't said a word since he entered. "Is that true?" he asked her directly. She looked around with an afflicted face and met Bhavin's stare. His eyes were pleading, begging her to let him redeem himself. With tears in her own eyes, she nodded. "Why, yes. That man's followers were holding us, and he threatened to use me to earn money. And Bhavin, he just wanted to protect us," she replied. "He's not a murderer," Fayyaz shouted, standing up. "It was an accident. He didn't know." Two other policemen entered the room and surrounded Fayyaz. "We'll need to continue with our investigation," the main officer said. "The two of you can help us by answering some questions in the other room. Now, please go with my partners." Charvi nodded and walked towards the door, crestfallen. Fayyaz wasn't so collaborative. "You can't put him in jail. He's not a criminal," he screamed, struggling against the policeman, who had to drag him outside by his arms. "You let him do that?" Arav asked angrily. They were back at home after picking him up at the hospital, and they had refused to tell him the story until then. It was his wish. What would you have done? If he hadn't said that, we'd all be in prison. Charvi replied. "It's the most mature thing he's ever done," Fayyaz said, shaking his head sadly. Arav slammed his fist on the table. "It's not fair. He was a victim, not a villain. But he did commit crimes," said Charvi quietly. Arav scowled at her. "Didn't we all? Shouldn't we all go and confess that we were working for that guy?" "That's not what he would want us to do," Fayyaz replied, clenching his fists. "It would only make everything worse. We need to respect his decision," he affirmed. They didn't eat or sleep that night. They remained awake, worried about the future of their friend and their own lives. Indeed, the businessman was dead, but that didn't mean their troubles were over. What was going to happen with the different organizations? Undoubtedly, they wouldn't continue to receive benefits from them. They had to start from scratch and hope the henchman or a possible successor wouldn't pursue them ever again. Those thoughts tormented them until early in the morning when exhaustion finally beat them one by one. The mobile's alarm rang loudly. "It's morning," Feyyaz shouted, lifting his face from the table. The other two jumped up, nearly falling from their chairs. "We've got to go visit Bhavin," Charvi said, looking for her bag frantically. "We can't leave without eating something, at least," Arav replied. "He'll get mad if we arrive without having had breakfast." Charvi stopped her search and looked at the fridge. "Oh, do you think they'll let us bring him food?" she wondered. "I don't see why not," Feyyaz replied. The friends arrived at the police station and were allowed to see Bhavin in the interrogation room. He looked depressed, but he smiled as soon as he saw them. "You look terrible," Arav told him. "You looked worse last time I saw you." "I wasn't the one beaten by a bunch of thugs," Bhavin replied. "It was nothing," Arav said. "Tell us about yourself." They sat down at the table. "Well," Bhavin began. "They told me that it's possible to allege that the homicide was unintentional and in self-defense, but you'll have to testify in court too." "Anything we can do to help?" Feyyaz quickly replied. "There's also the incident at the museum," he continued. "The cameras were off, so there's no evidence of you, of anyone else entering, but I had to confess I was there. And it's not just that." He made a pause. "Will you go to prison?" Charvi asked. Bhavin didn't look at her. "The investigation revealed I was at the location of an attack that occurred recently," he said. His voice was strangely emotionless. "But that doesn't prove anything, does it?" Feyyaz asked. "They found evidence of me being there minutes before the attack. And, considering my connection to the businessman, they can accuse me of terrorism," he finished. "What?" The response was simultaneous. "Terrorism? That's going too far," Feyyaz cried out. "Did you do it?" Arav inquired. Bhavin had a pained expression on his face. "Yes. I think I did. But I didn't know what I was carrying," he replied. Charvi bit her lip. "That's right. You didn't know," she exclaimed. "But I can't prove that," Bhavin replied. "And, even if I do, there are just too many charges against me to let me off the hook." The four friends looked at one another. "What are we going to do?" Feyyaz asked. "For now, I think you need to go," Bhavin said, pointing at the door. They could see the officer from the day before looking at them from the little window on it. "So soon?" Charvi asked. "They said it would have to be short," Arav replied. The friends stood up and got together for a group hug. "Go now, please," Bhavin urged them afterwards. His eyes were red and teary. "We'll see you in the trial," Arav said. Feyyaz waved goodbye with a hand, holding his own tears back. Charvi didn't even try. Back at the flat, the ambience couldn't possibly get gloomier. Charvi was focused on her smartphone screen, gripping it like it was her only hope. Feyyaz lay face down on the floor of the living room, arms extended to the sides. Arav was cooking an overly complicated lunch, trying to get himself distracted. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Feyyaz lifted his face from the floor and glanced at the door. "Who can open?" he asked, clearly not intent on moving. It rang again. "I'll go," Charvi yelled, running to check who was being so insistent. The next thing that was heard was a huge squeal coming from her, filling the entire place. Feyyaz stood up at once. "What is it?" Charvi opened the door completely. It was Bhavin. "You took my keys yesterday, remember?" he said, walking in. Charvi immediately squeezed him so hard she drew the air out of his lungs. The other two rushed towards him. What? How? When? Feyyaz couldn't find words to elaborate a proper question. Arav helped him. Weren't you in jail? He asked. Bhavan raised his arms. They let me go. He cried out. A while after you guys left, the policemen started walking back and forth in a weird way, and I heard them discussing outside. Then the officer entered, and he told me that they'd just received a call from their superior saying that the charges were dropped. Can you believe that? The excitement lasted a couple of seconds, but they all looked clearly concerned. Dropped charges? After everything you told us? Arav inquired. Did they tell you anything else? Charvi asked. Why did they let you go? Added Feyyaz. Bhavan shook his head. Your guess is as good as mine, he replied. To be honest, the officer didn't seem happy at all with his orders. I think he was as sure as I that they had a solid case and that I was doomed. There was anxiety in the air again. You don't think someone manipulated the police to let me go, right? Bhavan asked. Why would someone do that? At that moment, Bhavan's phone rang. He stared at the phone screen with an unknown number, gulped, and picked up. Hello? Hello, Bhavan. A distorted voice said, You don't know me, but I know you very well. Who is this? Charvi asked Bhavan. Bhavan put a finger to his lips. Your friends will surely be interested in our conversation, the voice continued. Put the call on speaker so they can hear too. Bhavan looked around. There weren't any open windows someone could watch them from. He decided to do as the voice said. You're on speaker, he said aloud, setting the phone on the table. Perfect, the voice replied. I'm sorry for interrupting your celebration, but I thought this would be the best time to call. The friends exchanged strange looks. Who are you? Arav asked. I'm the person who arranged Bhavan's immediate release. It would be a shame to send away an innocent boy for crimes he was set up to commit, the voice said. Bhavan stared at the phone reluctantly. What do you want? He asked. You're becoming more suspicious. That's good, the voice replied. What do you want? Feyyaz repeated aggressively. I just wanted to thank you. You don't owe me anything for this favor. Consider it an act of gratitude for getting rid of one of my main obstacles. One of your main obstacles? Charvi asked, disconcerted. Yes, the voice confirmed. The businessman was truly a foul man. Shamavli will be a better city without him. Arav stepped closer to the phone. You haven't answered my question, he said. Actually, I did, the voice replied. But if you want to know more about me, don't worry. You'll have time to meet me in person when I can reveal myself. In the meantime, we'll keep in touch like this. Beep. The call ended, leaving the friends as puzzled as they were before it. There were just too many questions unanswered. Who was that new mysterious person? Why had they helped Bhavan? And why hadn't the henchmen killed them on that alley? Were they going to continue being haunted? But it was too soon to worry about all those things. They were tired of suffering. At that moment, all they could do was celebrate their freedom and the end of that horrible nightmare. To be continued. This concludes The Journey Beneath the System, 1, by Swapnil Saurav. I hope you've enjoyed listening.